As a first-generation American, I feel that it is my responsibility to share my family's story, stories of escape, loss, and stories of life as they left Cuba. My dad and his twin brother were born in Guantanamo, Cuba on August 17, 1960, and for the first 6 years of his life, he lived in a one-room apartment with the rest of his family in the heart of the city. After his sister was born, the revolution made it too hard to live there any longer, and they decided to leave. The revolution completely changed the people and the country itself. Many fled in fear of what might happen next. The idea of leaving was difficult for my family to comprehend because Cuba was their home and it was all they knew. Regardless, my grandfather knew it would be better to leave in order to escape the oppression they faced there. They left for California and have never looked back.
When I left Cuba, we were 6 years old, so I don't have a lot of memory that I could say, well, I remember this, I remember that. I do remember where we lived, and especially when we went back right now. Just this past year, I remember when we got to the apartments that we grew up in, that we lived in. We were on the third floor, and I remember when we walked up there, a lot of memories started flooding back, even at that young age, and mostly just little things like the balcony, staring over the balcony. Now it's different, but back then there used to be actually horse and carriage that used to move people around. Like when you go to New York City, that you can go around Central Park on a horse and buggy type of thing. That's how it was in Cuba when I was a little boy in the early '60s, and so I kind of remember that kind of thing. But that's about pretty much it as a little boy.
After the revolution went into full swing, living conditions became difficult. Many people were taken prisoner just for their political beliefs or on false accusations, one of them being my grandfather.
Ya yo tenía toda mi familia también estaba allí en Cuba, en Guantánamo, y así vivió hasta que, gracias a Dios, que salió de la cárcel, puso mucho negocio allá, como ustedes lo saben, pero todo aquello fue en balde, porque ya él no se veía bien allí con las otras gente que estaban, los comunistas.
Towards the end of his life, with not even knowing that he was going to pass, he did start talking more about Cuba and opening up. And in all honesty, he was just accused of something wrongly. My dad was a man of business. He was actually had nothing to do with politics. He didn't even care about politics. It was more about just providing for his family. And
No me la permitían, la comida, la registraban. No me lo permitía, y si se lo daban, hacía que él buscara la manera de que si era algo, vaya a suponer, si se hacía algo que no le gustaba, pues no se la dejaban comer. Eso fue boniato. 2 o 3 veces ya dejé de ir con ustedes, porque cuando llegué allá lo llevé con un vestido como tenía que ser, y apenas llegué allí, me lo llevaron ustedes para el lugar ese donde registraban a uno, inclusive los zapatos, me quitaron los zapaticos y todo, y me dijeron a mí, el hombre que le hizo el registro, uno de los sinvergüenzas, eso que habían allí, me dijo, busca la manera de no traerlo más con ropa, porque no lo vamos a dejar entrar más con ropa. Así fue la cosa de un niño cuando lo llevé. Y le quitaron toda la ropa. Y él dijo, no me lo traiga más. Y después ya ustedes lo volvieron más, hasta que él salió. Porque dice, no me lo traiga más. Yo le dije, Nito, ¿por qué no hace esto? Fíjate que los muchachos y yo y eso, te echamos mucho de menos, busca la manera, a ver qué se me dijo, no. Tú busca la manera de cuidar a los muchachos. Y si es que ya no me quiere, me lo dice. Pero no, de aquí no me voy a ir hasta que no se cumpla lo que Dios disponga.
And what had happened is that they had a friend of his who was trying to get away from Cuba, was trying to get into the American base, because he's originally, we are from Guantanamo, where the American base is at, asked him for a ride to Caimanera, which is the border of where the American base is in Guantanamo. And my dad said, sure, I'll give you a ride. Well, they found out, or some of the people that were against or for the communists that was coming in, accused him of being part of a conspiracy to overturn the communist movement that was going on in that part of Cuba. And so he was sentenced to, I think it was 4 or 5 years, but he served about 2.5, almost 3 years in prison.
My grandfather died 5 years before I was born and was never able to see his old home again.
1 millón de gracias.
Ajá, encantado.
Ajá.
Si pueden venir después, más tarde.
Bueno, vamos a ver si lo da bien conmigo. Ajá. Aquí hacía yo el PRU.
¿El club?
Sí, el PRU. Vámonos, vámonos.
We were finally able to make it happen this last November, and it was an emotional experience for everyone. My grandmother is 82 and decided that she wanted to visit Cuba one last time. It had been over 50 years since she had last been there.
Al principio muy contenta por volver otra vez a Cuba y a Guantánamo, de donde yo soy. Pero a la vez después me sentí muy triste porque no era la Cuba que yo dejé.
The trip made the largest impact on my father. Seeing all the places and memories from his childhood proved to be more meaningful than he had anticipated.
I think one of them lives back here. Yeah. And we complain, huh?
It was hard for him to see how his family still lived.
Honestly, I don't think the Cuba trip hit me till about a month after we got home, is when it all really started sinking in, everything that we have gone through, everything we experienced, being there, being with my mom there, being with you, my kids, and my family members, our brothers and sisters. Unfortunately, not my dad. I think it all just came together so perfectly. I think God's plans are always the best, and I think it was the right time that we went.
Returning to Cuba was definitely an overwhelming experience for my grandmother. She began to reminisce about her old life and the memories of the revolution.
Horrible, horrible una cosa horrible, cuando mataban a la gente, inclusive hasta para llevarlo para el cementerio, lo llevaban por todo un lugar que se llama la carretera. Y había que ver eso, era una cosa horrible, horrible, cuando llegaron esta gente allá a Guantánamo. Mucha necesidad y muchos crímenes hubieron. Y nada, que el que no estaba con ellos, ya tú sabes, lo mataban y al contrario, lo que quitaban los negocios y todo así era. Malo, porque pasamos muchas necesidades, porque apenas él estuvo mucho tiempo preso, después que salió de la cárcel pasamos mucho trabajo, deseoso ya por venir para acá.
When we left Cuba, I don't remember a lot of that because, again, I was very young. But I do remember living in Spain because when we left Cuba, my father first applied for a visa to get out of Cuba immediately after he came out of prison. And actually, the country of Mexico offered him a way to get out. But it just happened that day, that plane that was leaving from Cuba during that exodus period of Cuban history, after the revolution, especially in the early 60s, people exiting out of the country, the flights to Mexico were canceled.
Sacamos unos pasaportes y una visa y eso para salir por España, que fue donde llegamos, a España. Y estuvimos en España casi 2 años allí. Y regresamos aquí a los Estados Unidos, que ya me estaba esperando mi mamá, que ya había venido.
My father was permitted to come into this country as a political asylum. When our visas finally arrived, there wasn't enough visas for all of us, so my dad decided to send my brother and I, at 6 years old, we were almost 7 at the time, to the United States by ourselves with a cousin of ours who was a few years older. Actually, he was 14 years old.
Bueno, pues nada, como tú, tu papá estaba preso
Sí, cuenta.
y después que salió de la cárcel decidimos ya venir para acá porque ya era una cosa que ya no había vida, constantemente lo estaban buscando y llegó el momento que ya no se podía vivir allí con él, porque él estaba en contra de todo eso, y entonces decidimos venir para Cuba acá.
That's what we did. We came to California, but we arrived before my mom did and my dad, as I mentioned it earlier. So we lived in Westminster. We lived with my grandmother for almost a year until my mom and dad came, my brother and I.
Comparezco para informar a nuestro pueblo, a los amigos de nuestra América y del mundo, que hoy, 25 de noviembre del 2016, a las 10:29 de la noche, falleció el comandante en jefe de la Revolución Cubana, Fidel Castro Ruz. En cumplimiento de la voluntad expresa del compañero Fidel, sus restos serán cremados. En las primeras horas de mañana, sábado 26, la comisión organizadora de los funerales brindará a nuestro pueblo una información detallada sobre la organización del homenaje póstumo que se le tributará al fundador de la Revolución Cubana.
A week into our return to Cuba, Fidel Castro died at the age of 90. After his death, the country entered a state of mourning for their leader. The consumption of alcohol was temporarily illegal, and any form of celebration was prohibited.
I mean, here we go back after 50 years. The last thing that I would have thought is that we were going to be there when Fidel Castro, takes his last breath. I mean, I've made some funnies about it. Some people have, when we got back, they said, "What did the CIA send you guys, or what?" But it was incredible. We were at where were we? I forgot exactly where I was, but I remember walking back. Oh, we were visiting somebody in Havana, and we were walking back towards the house we were staying at, and it was really quiet. But then when I got to the house, as soon as I opened the door, my younger brother says to me, he goes, "Did you hear the news?" I said, "What news?" He goes, "Fidel died." I'm like, "What?" I thought he was joking because he's such a joker. But then the guy that was renting the house to us, who lives there, who is living there, he says, "No, it's true. It's on the news." And I remember just being kind of in awe, but at the same time, it was weird. It was kind of an odd thing. It actually took me a couple days to actually chew on it and really accept it. And immediately we knew it really had happened because the country shut down. I mean, literally from being exuberant, alive, because again, Cuba has nothing, but the people are still very lively, very warm, and very fun, per se. Caribbeans, like most tropical people or people from the tropics are. The country shut down. So I knew it happened for real. And the fact that also it came out on TV for the next week, in the 3 TV stations that there are in Cuba, because there's only 3 TV stations controlled by the government. That's all they showed was the story on Fidel Castro and his life, and of course all the wonderful things and all how wonderful he is. But it was just incredible. It was shocking.
Con mucho dolor no, pero me alegré.
¿Por qué?
Porque sí, porque ya yo creo que era hora ya de que Dios pusiera de eso, porque ese hombre fue bien malo con todo el mundo, no con nosotros solamente, sino con Cuba entera.
I never realized how much my father had done to make this all possible. I was hesitant to leave California and into a country I'd heard so much about growing up, but I'm glad I did it. It was hard to leave knowing the state people were in, especially my family that's left there, and with the death of Fidel Castro, it made it even harder. I wondered, would my family's life change for the better or for the worse? When I returned to Los Angeles, one thing was for certain. I had a new perspective on what it meant to be an American.
I just want to thank God for this opportunity just to share how blessed I feel to be in this country. But there is no country like the United States of America. I've traveled all over the world. I've been blessed and privileged to be able to travel, being in the business for many years. And there is nothing like the United States of America. And I'm just so thankful for this country.
When I first made this documentary, I originally thought it was just going to be about my dad. But after this experience, I've come to realize it's about my family.